अस्सलाम वालेकुम। जेन ऑस्टन नॉवलिस्ट जो हैं वो स्टार्ट की हुई हैं। इनका प्राइड एंड प्रेजुडिस कंप्लीट कवर कर लिया है। एम्मा स्टार्ट किया था। एम्मा के करैक्टर लिस्ट जो है वो स्टार्ट की थी। कुछ करैक्टर्स जो थे उनकी वीडियो मैंने अपलोड कर दी थी। आई थिंक 10 की वीडियो मैंने अपलोड कर दी थी। आज नेक्स्ट जो हैं वो स्टार्ट करेंगे। मिस बेट्स, friend of Mr. Woodhouse and aunt of Jane Fairfax. Miss Bates is a middle-aged spinster without beauty or cleverness, but with universal goodwill and a gentle temperament. Emma's impatient treatment of her reveals the less attractive part of Emma's character. Isabella Knightley, Emma's older sister who lives in London with her husband, Mr. John Knightley, and their 5 children. Isabella is pretty amiable and completely devoted to her family, but slow and diffident compared to Emma. Her domesticity provides a contrast to the independent celibacy Emma imagined for herself. Mr. John Knightley, Emma's brother-in-law and Mr. George Knightley's brother. As a lawyer, John Knightley is clear-minded but somewhat sharp in temper, and Emma and her father are sometimes displeased with his severity. Mrs. Elton, formerly Augusta Hawkins. Mrs. Elton hails from Bristol and meet Mr. Elton in Bath. She is somewhat attractive and accomplished. She has some fortune and a well-married sister, but her vanity, superficiality, and vulgar over-familiarity offset her admirable qualities. Mr. Watson's ailing former sister-in-law. Next है Mrs. Churchill. Mr. Watson's ailing former sister-in-law and Frank Churchill's aunt and guardian. She is known to be capricious, ill-tempered, and extremely possessive of Frank. Frank is able to marry Jane as he desires only after Mrs. Churchill's death. Colonel Campbell, a friend of Jane's father who lives in London and who takes charge of orphaned Jane when she is 8 years old. Colonel Campbell feels great affection for Jane but is unable to provide her with an inheritance. Next है Mrs. Dexter. The Campbell's daughter and Jane's friends, Mrs. Dixon, lacks beauty and lives with her husband in Ireland. Mr. Deacon, husband to the Campbell's daughter. Emma suspects that Mr. Deacon had a romance with Jane Fairfax before his marriage. Mrs. Goddard, mistress of the local boarding school. Mrs. Goddard introduces Harriet Smith to the Woodhouse. Mr. Bates, mother to Miss Bates and friend of Mr. Woodhouse, an elderly woman. Mrs. Bates is quite amiable and somewhat deaf. Mr. Perry, an apothecary and associate of Emma's father. Mr. Perry is highly esteemed by Mr. Woodhouse for his medical advice, even though he is not a proper physician, and Mr. Woodhouse argues with his daughter Isabella over Perry's recommendation. Elizabeth Martin, Mr. Martin's kind sister with whom Harriet was good friends before meeting Emma and turning down Mr. Martin's marriage proposal. Harriet's feeling of guilt and her desire to rekindle her relationship with Elizabeth pose a dilemma for Emma, who finds the Martin pleasant, worthy people, but worries that Harriet may be tempted to accept Mr. Martin's offer if she again grows a close grows close with the family. Mr. and Mrs. Cole are tradespeople and long-time residents of Highbury, whose good fortune of the past several years has led them to adopt a luxurious lifestyle that is only a notch below that of the Woodhouse. Offended by their attempt to transcend their only moderately gentle social status, Emma has long been preparing to turn down any dinner invitation from the Coles in order to teach them their folly in thinking they can interact socially with the likes of her family. Like the Martins, the Coles are the means through which Emma demonstrates her class consciousness. आज जो है वो जेन ऑस्टन के नावल एम्मा की करैक्टर लिस्ट जो है वो कंप्लीट हो चुकी है। कल इसकी समरी स्टार्ट करेंगे। अगर समरी लंबी हुई तो वो भी 2 पार्ट में होगी, नहीं तो 1 पार्ट में ही। ओके, अल्लाह हाफिज़, स्टे ट्यून, सब्सक्राइब माई चैनल, लाइक माई वीडियोज़ एंड कमेंट, शेयर भी करें ताकि दूसरे लोगों को भी ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा मेरे चैनल का पता चले, उनका भी कुछ भला हो जाए। अल्लाह हाफिज़।